Record. Hello and welcome to Responsible Futures Emissions Mastery class. I'm Sam Candy, CEO of Responsible Futures, an organisation dedicated to guiding, inspiring and educating people and businesses to become more sustainable and socially responsible through consulting, training, educational webinars and masterclasses. I'm joined by Gavin Lendon, an associate of Responsible Futures and founder of Sustainology UK. He is GRI qualified, Westminster Business Council Property and Construction ESG lead, has been a sustainability professional since 2018, focused on carbon reporting, including footprint calculation and SBTi, sustainable strategy, biodiversity and ESG reporting. But me and Gavin, over the last couple of months, we've had an influx of inquiries requesting support on carbon reduction plans, SBTi submissions and net zero targets, which is exactly why we wanted to do this masterclass today. Welcome, Gavin. It's good to have you here.
Thank you. Always good to see you.
Yeah, I think most of the viewers may have a good idea, but it's good to just start with and set the scene with what greenhouse gas emissions are, what the greenhouse gas protocol is, and also explain scopes 1, 2 and 3. Over to you.
Awesome. Awesome. Right. So in simple terms, we keep talking about the planet warming up, and that's a function of the greenhouse gases. Most people are familiar with carbon dioxide, and most people somehow or sometimes equate greenhouse gases just to be purely carbon. But the greenhouse gases include other things such as methane, nitrous oxide, and a number of other sort of hydrocarbon-based gases. As a consequence of them being released, they are forming a bit of a barrier to keep heat inside the atmosphere, which is why the planet as a whole is warming up. So back in the 1990s, there was a view that we would have to come to some sort of standardized approach to reducing emissions, which involved, of all the people in the world, BP, which is quite surprising for most people to realize that they were involved near the start. The first standard itself was issued in 2001. Prior to that, there was a number of releases released. But in 2001, the first edition of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Standard was released. And that is when the wonderful scopes 1, 2, and 3 began to appear on people's radars. Sam and myself have discussed scopes 1, 2, and 3 a lot, and there are moments where both of us look at each other quizzically because they do change over time. Scope 1 is basically those emissions that you are directly responsible for from your production or your direct kind of activity. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions that result from that, which basically is the energy you're using in terms of electricity, gas, or whatever. Then we have this wonderful scope 3, which is indirect emissions, which you can't really control, but you can influence. The reason I made the reference to looking at each other quizzically is as a function of COVID, a lot of companies then swapped to a hybrid or work from home kind of environment, which is now a scope 3 emission, and that's how it has to be treated. Scope 3 has been split into 15 different categories, which is quite confusing, and we can talk about that in due course. Sam mentioned SBTi. SBTi stands for Science-Based Targets Initiative. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol tells you how to calculate your emissions historically, which is great. But what we're trying to do is get people to get their emissions down to achieve the climate objectives as set out in the Paris Agreement in 2015. That's to achieve net zero, et cetera, et cetera. Science-based targets introduces a methodology to achieve that between a base date and a target date. And so it looks forward, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Sorry, Sam, I'm getting enthusiastic. I do apologize.
No, we like enthusiasm, and actually SBTi is probably more in the front of lots of the other ones, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, good. I think the scene is set. Let's talk about the importance of accurately measuring emissions for organisations that are aiming to set either science-based targets or to achieve net zero emissions.
That, I got to admit, is a fascinating question because unlike standard financial accounting, which you can have definitive answers, carbon accounting stroke greenhouse gas emissions is a little bit more tricky. So for the direct emissions in scopes 1 and 2, you probably have the information available. But for scope 3, you start getting into the world of, hang on, how much carbon's been emitted by that lawyer sending me a bill. So you start having to look at activity data about what kind of things are you doing? How far did you drive a car to get from London to Edinburgh? How many miles was that? How many kilometers? And to that activity, you apply a conversion factor, which you can get from, in terms of the car travel, DEFRA have an amazing spreadsheet with conversion factors. So over time, your point about accurately measuring is going to improve as the data becomes, or the conversion factor becomes more accurate. And as companies actually look at this activity data and say, how can we improve this? Because, I mean, if I just turned up to Joe Blogs Limited and say, right, we'll do your carbon footprint. How far did you travel last year? And they go, not sure. So as you know, we have a client together, Sam and myself, where we're using employee surveys to actually estimate activity data. But over time, that can be refined. We can get that, we can improve the data. And by improving the data, we improve the accuracy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that comes on nicely to the challenges, and every single company is individual. But what are some of the common challenges that you're seeing?
Well, that's kind of very interesting as well, because it does depend on the size of the organization. Larger organizations obviously are more complex. They will have subsidiaries, they will have associates, they'll have joint ventures. Should they account for the emissions for all of those? So the greenhouse gas protocols come up with various methodologies. You can either use a financial control basis, where you would then follow basically accounting principles. So you take an equity share of the emissions of the smaller companies, of the associates and the joint ventures, or you can use an operational control. If you basically have control of those organizations, you bring in the whole set of emissions because basically you're responsible for it. So that is setting the organizational boundary. That's one challenge. Secondly is actually figuring out what your emissions are, what is actually known as your inventory, because there are emissions that you probably haven't even thought of. So, I mean, we all work for various organizations, and we create waste. We throw things away. Great. Has anyone ever measured how much waste you're throwing away? No. So you have a lot of the carbon calculators that will say, okay, we don't know how much waste you've thrown away, but roughly how many bin bags did you fill up? Or was it organic waste? Was it this type of waste? So over time, those challenges can be refined as you understand more about the problem. Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. If anyone's got any questions, by the way, please put them in the Q&A. I've got lots and lots of questions, so maybe if you wait to the end, it might already be asked, but do put your questions in if you have them. I think that also leads on to how you ensure data accuracy and reliability when collecting the emissions data. And actually, is it important, I guess, when you're setting your baseline or further down the line, how important is it that it is totally accurate?
So if you go back to first principles, what are you trying to achieve? What is the greenhouse gas protocol trying to achieve? It's trying to get almost like a standard measurement, so companies can compare against one another if they want to. Also, you can compare about how you're doing over time. So as a consequence of that, you want to start using a standardized measurement kind of protocol. So that would be a great thing to do. I mentioned DEFRA have got their own conversion factors. The IPCC also help. There are other various organizations, depending on which country you're based in, that will help provide sort of information and data. For example, we're in the UK, Sam and myself, so DEFRA will provide information about how much emissions are generated from what we call our national grid, which is basically where we draw our electricity from. We have a fairly decent percentage of renewables in the UK. Other countries don't. Other countries have more. So as a consequence, depending on where you are and the electricity you're using, that has a different an emission factor. So that is important to take into consideration. One other aspect is calibrating and quality control. So you're trying to make sure that you weed out any potential errors in the data, validating the data, cross-referencing it against other sources, third-party assurance, if possible. Transparent documentation. That is important to me, because if I turn up and I say to you, what was the leakage from your air conditioning system this year? Probably about 20 what? So you need to document how you've arrived at your conclusions, for want of expression, because that's particularly important if you go for SBTi, because they will come in to try and validate your targets and validate how you've arrived at the information. So if you can't express to them, I use this approach, here's the documentation to support that, then that's challenging. Equally, the data has to be traceable. So you have to demonstrate where the information came from. Equally, in some situations, particularly on scopes 1 and 2, continuous monitoring. There's a conference in London every year called MX, and that will provide lots of tools and gadgets that will continuously monitor your scope 1 and scope 2 type outputs.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah, well, actually, are there, I know some people will start off with an Excel spreadsheet, but are there some examples of best practices for organizations to effectively track and report their emissions over time, or just do it?
I totally agree. I think a colleague of Sam's and mine, a lady called Ilana, I think she expressed that 90% of businesses still maintain their emissions data on Excel spreadsheets, which, okay, fine, it's a record, but Excel is only good at recording. It's not great for manipulating going forwards. So one thing you're trying to achieve is integrating some of the more commercial platforms that will help you calculate the emissions, et cetera, et cetera. Also, going forward, there's some things you can do, because one of the things which we haven't touched on, which is probably near the most important, is as a function of setting SBTi, using the greenhouse gas protocol and setting up the targets, and they demonstrate a reduction, naturally you have to create a carbon reduction plan. So as a consequence of trying to achieve that, which is important for SBTi, but for large UK businesses now trying to borrow money from some of the larger banks, they will require a carbon reduction plan as well. An Excel spreadsheet might not cut it with that. So what kind of things can you do? For example, IKEA have tried to now utilize as much renewable and recycled material as possible in their products, which will automatically reduce their emissions. So that's a great example. Another great example is scope 3 emissions, business travel. which is a subject dear to your heart, Sam, as we both know.
It is, yeah.
Um, as a consequence of their approach and their need to reduce their carbon emissions, there's an insurance company called Swiss Re. Um, and what they decided to do was to incentivize their staff to choose the most carbon efficient methods of transport. And to do that, they put a carbon levy on the air travel, for sake of argument. So that was as a consequence, they reduced their carbon emissions in scope 3, which is an area they haven't got direct control of, but they can influence, and they influenced it by using a carbon levy.
Yeah, I think the business travel industry is starting to move in that way, in the managed travel programs. There's some fantastic tools that are really, really specific. When I was with a client the other day, and we were speaking about it. But do you, do you think that technology and data analytics then are, I think, we're seeing so many innovations with this data and analytics. I saw a fantastic one the other day that included not just the emissions, but also the social value, so it can all be measured and put it into an impact report at the end of that. So do you think that it is improving, and we're going to see even further improvements in the future?
Definitely. So the role for technology and AI in this process is going to be great, both in terms of the carbon reporting and how you do your calculations. That'll make will make your life easier. But there's an organization called Schneider Electric, and if you've attended Sustainability Live like myself, and the Schneider session is the first one on day one, and it's been the same for 2 years running, but it's an amazing listen, and they demonstrate using technology how we can achieve what we need to achieve. It's just they need more people to listen, and that's just using AI, controlling how power is used, etc., etc. And it's amazing.
Yeah.
Massive potential.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, and I think, when it comes to employees and engaging employees, but also engaging with your suppliers, do you think that, do you have any tips, or how can you recommend that organisations engage with their stakeholders regarding emissions reduction efforts?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. To me, to achieve what we want to achieve in terms of the Paris Agreement, it's a collective effort. And for most organizations, scope 3 is roughly about 85% of their emissions, which, as I've said, you can't directly control, but you can influence. And as a consequence of that, influencing involves conversations with stakeholders. And if you think about one of the largest areas of emissions in scope 3 is buying goods and services, which is basically your supply chain. And if I use some examples, NHS, CERN in Switzerland, AstraZeneca, which is a function of working for the NHS. So we'll start with the NHS. The NHS is aiming to achieve net zero, I think 5 or 10 years earlier than the rest of the UK. The NHS is, as most people know, one of the world's largest employers, and it has tremendous influence with its suppliers because it happens to be one of their largest. In terms of Novo Nordisk, it's their largest customer. So what the NHS want, the NHS tend to get. So as a consequence of trying to get to becoming a much greener organization, they took their largest suppliers aside and basically say, we're trying to achieve this by 2035. To achieve this, we need you on this journey. We need you to come up with some ideas. And they've all agreed and signed up to massive reduction in carbon emissions. How that's kind of materialized in the case of AstraZeneca is AstraZeneca said, right, we've got to reduce our carbon emissions as a consequence, they've now started speaking to their suppliers and said, we need to do that. So you can see the stakeholder engagement going all along. The way it's manifested at AstraZeneca is they now require their key suppliers to complete the CDP climate questionnaire, and also their suppliers have to sign up to science-based targets.
Yeah, I think this is great, because the more that this happens and the more the larger companies ask for their suppliers to do it, then their suppliers are going to have to engage and educate and understand. And I guess that's part of the reason that we're starting to get so many calls, because the suppliers are enforcing it, that the companies are enforcing it to their suppliers a little bit more.
Yeah, you can see it in Tesco's. Tesco's are doing it.
Yeah.
Most of the large UK companies, CERN is Swiss-based, obviously, and it's happening in Europe as well.
Yeah.
It unfortunately it's trickled down, but if we can see more people from the bottom saying, okay, it's coming, I might as well start now. Brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah. Just with regard to the SBTi science-based targets, do you can you think of some key strategies for setting ambitious but achievable targets?
Right. So to answer that question, you have to put it into context what science-based targets is trying to achieve. So it's got a specified objective. It's trying to align targets with the Paris Agreement. So as a consequence, that end goal is roughly immovable. So as a consequence, once you've calculated your organizational boundary and your inventory, you've got your base year, more almost. If you then go to science-based targets, going, all right, this is my base year, and I want to achieve a near-term target by 2030. You will then be provided with the SBTi tool, and you type in your data, and the SBTi tool generates some targets for you. You don't have to subscribe to those targets. You can become more ambitious, but those targets are aligned with achieving 1.5, which is the Paris Agreement, basically. You can become more aggressive, but the level of reduction that is required to achieve 1.5 is pretty hard to, well, not hard, but it's pretty aggressive. So that's on scope 3, they're a little bit more lenient in the sense of you can try and achieve 1.5, or you can try and achieve something they're calling well below 2 degrees.
Yeah.
And that's a much more lenient profile consequently.
Yeah. So, I guess in some cases they want to see the proof, and it starts to get a little bit more difficult. Do you think that the landscape of emissions measurement and reporting evolving, that's, coming in the future years, what implications is this going to have for organizations? Are they going to get pulled
We
into
we
this?
can actually talk about that in real terms, in a real situation, because as both of us know, what happened in 2023 was it was the first year where we breached 1.5 for the whole year. Now, as a function of that, most legislation at the moment talks about, please tell us what your carbon emissions are. Right. So you can do a historical calculation of what your carbon emissions were for that reporting year. So what I personally think will happen is SBTi will almost become mandatory. People will be told, you now need to hit a target, you need to take targets. We need ambition, we need things to achieve. So I personally believe that SBTi will become mandatory for most organizations.
Yeah. So it's then they're certainly going to have to prepare. What at the moment, can you explain what level, what size an organisation needs to be that is going to have to do mandatory reporting?
Right. So I'm going to take that question in two parts. So in terms of mandatory reporting, most jurisdictions start with the largest companies, and also any company that's listed on the stock exchange and probably finance companies. So if we take the EU as to start with, most of their legislation is now encompassed in their corporate sustainability reporting directive.
Yeah.
And the emissions reporting is within that because it follows GRI principles. At the moment, that's historical looking, so it looks back. At the moment, that is scheduled for the largest companies. However, this is the EU, and the EU is kind of aggressive in the fact it wants to move the entire market across to a greener economy. So whilst at the moment this year it's large companies, by 2028 it's going to be almost all companies.
Yeah.
So that's a fairly aggressive timetable. The UK at the moment is large companies. When I say large, I'm talking 500 employees, over 250 million turnover, that kind of thing. So where the EU's going is it's going to be much lower than that over time.
Yeah. What about if you're a UK based company or anywhere else in the world, but you do business in the EU? Is that?
Yes, it is. That will be caught around about 2027. The phraseology is significant business. And that is, I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but I will take a punt that it's around about 100 million euros,
Right.
that kind of level. It's going to be most multinationals.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, they will have to report under the CSRD.
Yeah. Okay. I wondered if you can maybe share some success stories or case studies. Talked about some that we've done together, where they've effectively measured emissions, set science-based targets, and made a significant progress towards achieving net zero emissions.
Yes, again, I'm going to go back to Snyder because if you go to the SBTi website, you can actually see which companies have committed, which companies have got targets, and there's a drop-down box which is companies when did they commit? Snyder committed second. So the first is a Belgian company that I hadn't heard of, but Snyder I know and love.
We're not sponsored by Snyder, by the way.
Yes, yeah. Maybe next time it will be. Snyder have made astronomical steps and in terms of reducing their emissions. Why are they doing this? What's in their interest? I mean, number one, you'll probably spot that me and Sue and me and Sam have both heard of it. So brand recognition, massive. More profitable, more innovative, all as a function of reducing their emissions. Absolutely brilliant. More recently, one of the clients that Sam and myself are working on is a Manchester-based company. They are adopting SBTi, possibly as a function of what AstraZeneca do, which is one of their customers, but more likely it's in line with their overall ethos because they are sustainably orientated. And as a function of that, they want to demonstrate what they're trying to achieve. So that would be the examples I would use.
Yeah, and it gets hard when, you know, a company is already being really sustainable, and then to get those SBTIs, you have to push it even further.
Yes, you're gradually edging towards offsetting. So the SBTi is not over keen on offsetting.
Neither am I.
No, I know. I was just about to say it's a discussion Sam and myself have on a regular basis. The SBTi article says that there's one on their website that says people seem to be fixated on the net rather than the zero. As a consequence of that, they're basically implying that a large number of organizations are buying massive amounts of offsets to achieve the net of the zero. Some of myself have had discussions on this basis for a long time. We've now come around to the point of view collectively that organizations should try and reduce their emissions by around about 95%, and then they can offset the remaining 5 to 10% if there's 90% for sake of argument. SBTi tend to lean that way as well. They want to see people, to use that wonderful euphemism, they want to see people put skin in the game, not be lazy. The idea behind an emission target is to reduce your emissions. It's not to go out there and just take a shortcut and buy a forest down in Brazil. It's not going to work. They want to see people making an effort to consciously reduce their emissions. That's our view collectively at Responsible Futures.
And I also, I think the word offsetting, it's a bit of a dirty word, and it's a shame because it's all about investing in nature. So it should be done, outside of your emissions. It's very much, in some industries they relate it so much, but it really should be thought of as a separate process.
I totally agree with you. This is slightly off-piste for the emissions discussion, but the emissions problem is only one part of the crisis we're facing. One of the other huge challenges is biodiversity, which is obviously a subject I know and love. And these projects that are creating more forests, creating more natural habitat, reintroducing wetlands, planting mangrove swamps, etc., are great to solve the biodiversity crisis. So they shouldn't be dismissed.
But if people are at the stage where they're looking at SBTIs and net zero targets and emission reductions, they should also be looking at biodiversity and nature-based as well, which should form part of their holistic approach to being more sustainable. And something else I think is worth mentioning, and because it's come up in a situation with our own business, and I know that there's some people that registered for this webinar and that are in the same situation. If your company is, if you have a parent company and then there are offsets of other companies underneath that, how do you can you set the SBTIs? I think you know the topic, the situation that I'm talking about without mentioning companies' names. Can you go into a bit of detail about that, because that does become quite complex?
For reference, this is a challenge that Sam and myself approached in November and December of last year. The SBTi had a definition of an SME, a small and medium-sized enterprise, which they said they were going to change on the 1st of January. Prior to the 1st of January 2024, if you were a small and medium enterprise in terms of your turnover, in terms of your balance sheet, in terms of number of employees, and basically your the way you operated, you could submit a nice, simple, very reduced form to get SBTi to say, yes, you set some targets. They realized that a lot of subsidiaries were doing that. And as a consequence, they basically said, well, if you're now a subsidiary from the 1st of January 2024, you can no longer use the SME route to set targets. You now have to do a full validation and have to set the targets on a full basis. So it's slightly more work. To use the phrase of the client, or it's a lot more paperwork. It's probably 2 more sheets on an Excel spreadsheet, if truth be told. But as a consequence, it does become slightly more scary. It's like people have an aversion to a tax return. Same sort of principle. You get asked more questions.
Yeah, thanks. I thought it's worth explaining that, because I know that there are people that signed up that are in that position. Just want to move on to how companies can ensure transparency and credibility, so important, in their emission measurement and reporting processes.
Yes. So there's a number of ways to answer that question. So in terms of SBTi, they will look at your targets and how you've arrived at your inventory or whatever. So they will be looking how you've arrived at the numbers you're quoting. So they will be digging down into that. However, your question is probably more relevant to how do you report to the wider public about your emissions? And I've seen some companies say, we have a methodology document, it is here. So they will cross-reference it on their website. Others will express it more actually within the actual impact report or whatever. So they will talk about how they've measured things, what's the basis for some of the assumptions they've made, that kind of thing. But one of the objectives of the greenhouse gas protocol is transparency. So as a consequence, you've kind of got the onus on you to explain how you arrived at your emissions figures. So that's good.
Yeah, I do think as well, when it comes down to it, when people are looking at their suppliers, the days of, oh yes, we've got a net zero target and it is by 2050 is not going to cut it, and they're going to be pushed to say, okay, you said that, but can you show us the data and show us where you're going to do that and how you're going to do that and what your numbers are. So I think naturally, as the world is evolving and people are coming more seeing this more and more, it is going to grow, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the question now is, company A says, I have a net zero target of 2045. And Sam and myself would turn up and say, how are you going to achieve that? And we're not on our own. More and more companies and more people are saying, how are you going to achieve it? Because as you say, so many people just said 2050. Where's the support? It's now, I mean, you've done a great session with Tash Morganetti on greenwashing. So saying I've got a net zero target of 2035, June the 5th, potential greenwashing.
Yeah.
Unless it's supported.
Mm.
And that is where some of the strands begin to come together. Because if you make a statement that's saying, I've got a net zero target of 2040, it's got to be now be supported. There's
Yeah.
got to be a rationale on how you achieved it. Science-based targets gives you that rationale.
Yeah, it really does. And, again, we're not sponsored by or promoting particularly SBTi, it's carbon reduction plans or net zero plans or whatever it is. It's just about having that transparency and authenticity, because ultimately the laws are changing, and, and people are calling companies out a lot more as well. I think that it's becoming, quite apparent that if you are saying something and it's not true, then you are going to get called out. How can organizations, actually this is something that comes up a lot, that they effectively integrate emission reductions into their overall business strategy and operations? And just, if a company is like, well, we don't want to halt our business, we still want to be profitable, and if you're reducing your emissions, then can you still be profitable? So I think that comes into that business strategy.
It does. Again, a subject we both love.
Yeah.
More and more companies are realizing that adopting a sustainability strategy does not mean reducing profits. You see that in terms of the ESG advocates are saying, by adopting ESG, you'll become more profitable, and more investors are saying, yes. Equally, adopting a carbon emission strategy, even if it's supported by SBTi, investors will say, yeah, that's a good company. They're going in the right direction. They're managing their risks. A lot of insurers, banks see carbon as a risk, because if you are seen as an emitter and someone who's emitting more, you become less attractive in terms of investments. So there's a huge financial incentive to become more carbon considerate. Integrating the carbon reduction plan and the sustainability strategy into overall corporate strategy they can't sit next to each other. They have to be one.
Mm. Yeah, I totally agree. I always talk about that holistic approach. What about the financial implications, both short-term and long-term, for organisations that are transitioning to net zero emissions, and how can they manage these effectively?
Like most things, like any new strategy, a new strategy will involve a transition period where you're training people to get the right skill sets, the right attitudes and approaches. Equally, you might have to invest in certain new protocols and procedures. So, as a consequence, there is possibly going to be a near-term investment, but a long-term gain.
Mm.
I don't think anyone can point to a long-term cost.
Mm.
It's definitely a gain, but there may be, as with any directional corporate strategy change, there is potentially, to get people up to speed, you'll have to invest a bit of time and possibly a bit of money, but it will be easily offset by the gains.
Mm. I always talk about sustainability as an opportunity. Often speaking to companies, and they might have a negative feel about it, and might look at the opportunity that it can create.
The challenge is it a cost or is it an investment?
Mm.
Coming back to your point about it's an opportunity.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. A couple more questions here. And as I say, if anyone does have any questions, please do put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Just a couple more. What are some of the misconceptions? Actually, we've spoken a lot about them throughout this conversation, but what are some of the common misconceptions of that organisations should be aware of when they're measuring their emissions or setting science-based targets?
The biggest one, it comes back to my the tax return analogy. People have a perception that greenhouse gas protocol, SBTi, scopes 1, 2, and 3 are complicated. They're not. They are. They are. Once you've got into the under the bonnet, they're pretty common sense.
Yeah.
That is probably the biggest pitfall. If you need someone to guide you first, fine, we're more than willing to help. But once you've overcome the fact that there's a lot of terminology, there's a lot of people trying to make it more complicated than it actually is, it's pretty common sense, and it does make a hell of a lot of sense. The other pitfalls would be, where do you draw the inventory, where do you draw the organizational boundary, and where do you draw the actual inventory? But that's technical stuff.
Yeah.
But the biggest hurdle to overcome first is to get into it in the first place. It's a lot easier than people think.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'm frozen a little bit there. Finally, my last question is, what advice would you give to organisations that are just starting their journey towards measuring emissions, or actually most people on here are already measuring their emissions, but setting science-based targets or transitioning to net zero?
I think to be pretty blunt about it, adopt Nike's kind of attitude. Just do it. Seriously, I mean, it sounds bad, it sounds hard. It's not. That's the message we need to get across. It's something that is going to have to be done anyway. You've seen, we've already talked about what happened in 2023 in terms of we breached 1.5. So legislation will come. In the UK, we are likely, not definitely, likely to have a change of government. As a consequence of that, I suspect we're going to have a lot more greener legislation, and SBTi could well be part of that.
Yeah.
So it's coming.
Yeah, and don't be scared.
Get on the racetrack and run.
Yeah, there's plenty of people that will help. We have actually got to the end 10 minutes earlier, and there hasn't been any questions, but when I was putting the questions together and sent them over to Gavin, we were like, there's a lot of questions, but don't worry. But actually we've whizzed through all the questions. So I hope that the people that have tuned in and the people that will listen to the recording after have got a lot, or what they hoped out of it. I'm just going to share. There's oops, sorry, not that. I'm just going to share with you, if you would like to contact me, or need a bit of help with your net zero targets, or with SBTIs or anything like that, please do contact myself and Gavin. And yeah, I hope that everyone has enjoyed it, and do reach out if you need any help. My internet at the end of this has been very, very slow and tacky, but thank you, Gavin, so much for joining. I am sure people will be able to take so many points away with them. And thanks, everyone, for joining us.
My pleasure. Can I just add that there are also a huge number of webinars on the Responsible Futures podcast channel, covering a huge range of issues. The one with Tash Morganetti is to die for, because it's got a great title.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gavin, and thanks everyone for joining us. Okay.